Love can make people build a home, but betrayal teaches them how to destroy it in the most calculated way. Close your eyes and listen. Imagine a dark, cinematic bass line pulsing softly in the background, setting a heavy, ominous mood. Over it, the faint, urgent wail of an ambulance siren echoes from miles away, cutting through the biting wind of a frosty November morning. Beneath that siren is the horrific, guttural sound of heavy, labored breathing, and beneath it all, the steady, unforgiving tick-tock of a clock running out of time. That it was 8:02 a.m. when the tranquil, coastal facade of Salisbury, Massachusetts, was shattered by a 911 call. But what sends a chill down the spine isn't a frantic scream or a desperate plea for salvation. It is the eerily calm, almost hollow voice of a woman. She isn't crying. She isn't shouting. She speaks with the practiced, deliberate composure of someone who has already watched the ending of the movie and is simply waiting for the credits to roll. The woman on the line was Judy Church, a former school teacher in her late 60s. The man fighting for every excruciating breath on the floor was her boyfriend, Leroy Fowler, a man just weeks shy of his 55th birthday. When first responders rushed through the doors of their Salisbury home, they were immediately struck by a profound and unsettling contradiction. We tend to imagine the home of a retired educator as a sanctuary of order books neatly aligned on shelves, lesson plans filed away, a life of meticulous organization. But the house they stepped into was a hoarder's labyrinth. The assault on the senses was immediate and overwhelming. Trash bags were piled high against the walls, creating narrow, claustrophobic pathways through the rooms. But it was the smell that lingered in the memories of the investigators, a nauseating cocktail of rotting, stale food aggressively masked by the stinging, sterile odor of harsh bleach and industrial cleaning chemicals. It was the scent of chaos trying desperately to hide its own decay. Amidst this squalor lay Leroy, his body convulsing, his organs shutting down one by one, thrashing against an invisible enemy that was tearing him apart from the inside out. Leroy was rushed to the hospital, but his condition plummeted with terrifying speed. Doctors were baffled. He was experiencing catastrophic renal failure, his kidneys essentially turning to stone. It wasn't a heart attack. It wasn't a stroke. As medical professionals scrambled, running toxicology screens and desperately trying to stabilize his plunging vitals, the dark truth finally revealed itself in his blood work. It was a chemical assault. Leroy Fowler had ingested a massive, lethal dose of ethylene glycol. For those unfamiliar, ethylene glycol chemically represented as HOCH2CH2O. HOCH2CH2O is the primary, highly toxic ingredient found in commercial antifreeze. I want you to understand the sheer cruelty of this specific poison. When consumed, the liver metabolizes it into glycolic acid and then into oxalic acid, which binds with calcium to form jagged, microscopic calcium oxalate crystals. Imagine millions of microscopic shards of glass filtering through your kidneys, physically shredding the tissue until the organs entirely shut down. The victim remains conscious for much of this agony, suffering through hyperventilation, agonizing muscle cramps, and profound neurological collapse. But ethylene glycol possesses a deeply deceptive trait that makes it a murderer's weapon of choice. It is intensely sweet. It masks itself perfectly when mixed with sugary beverages. Somewhere in that filthy house, someone had handed Leroy a bright orange drink, perhaps a vibrant orange Fanta or a citrus Powerade, laced with a fatal dose of this sweet, syrupy poison. He had swallowed his own death, completely unaware, perhaps even smiling at the woman who handed it to him while doctors fought a losing battle for Leroy's life. The police arrived at the Salisbury house to speak with Judy. Picture the scene. The biting November wind whistling through the cracks of the old wooden windows, snapping at the collars of the detectives' coats as they stood on the cold sidewalk. Judy refused to let them inside. She stood in the doorway, physically blocking the threshold, her demeanor shifting from composed to fiercely defensive. As the detectives questioned her, the sound of tires crunching on gravel broke the tension. It was Douglas Leroy's son, arriving in a panic. The dynamic shifted instantly. Judy's eyes narrowed, her body language tightened. When Douglas demanded to know what happened to his father, Judy offered no comfort. Her voice, raspy and trembling with a cocktail of exhaustion and deeply rooted resentment, cut through the cold air. You can almost hear the bitterness dripping from her words as she muttered, "I've done everything for that man." To understand the sheer weight of that statement, we have to rewind the clock. How does a respected, educated woman standing at the chalkboard of a classroom become the primary suspect in a brutal poisoning? Let's look back to 2012. Judy Church was married to a man named Rusty. She had a stable life, a predictable routine, the kind of quiet suburban existence society expects. But then she met Leroy Fowler. Leroy was a bad boy in the classic sense. Charming, rough around the edges, unpredictable, and entirely intoxicating for a woman who had lived her life by the rules. He was a contractor, a man who worked with his hands, carrying a rugged magnetism that Judy simply could not resist. She didn't just fall in love. She became consumed. She dismantled her entire life for him. She left her husband, Rusty. She abandoned her stable foundation, and her sacrifices were not just emotional, they were deeply financial. Judy became Leroy's benefactor. She bought him a car. She purchased the house they lived in. She paid the utility bills, funded his lifestyle, and anchored him when he drifted. She invested her money, her reputation, and her twilight years into keeping this younger, wilder man by her side. She had purchased his loyalty, or so she thought. I often wonder, looking at this case, what happens to the human psyche when an investment of that magnitude begins to fail? Judy had burned her bridges to build a fortress for Leroy, but as the years dragged on, the fortress turned into a prison of piled garbage, rotting food, and suffocating resentment. Leroy was a man who couldn't be caged by financial dependence forever. He was restless, and Judy's suffocating grip was beginning to chafe. Her trembling assertion, "I've done everything for that man," wasn't a cry of grief over a dying boyfriend. It was the furious, deeply ingrained entitlement of a woman who felt she owned him. But as the police stood on that sidewalk, barred from entering the home that reeked of bleach and secrets, they couldn't help but notice the panic dancing behind Judy's stoic eyes. She wasn't keeping them out because she was grieving. She was keeping them out because of what she hadn't yet had time to clean up. And as Leroy took his final, agonizing breaths in a sterile hospital room miles away, the investigators began to peel back the layers of their toxic relationship, uncovering a bitter truth. Judy's ultimate sacrifice wasn't enough to keep Leroy's eyes from wandering. A shadow had fallen over their relationship, a third person who had ignited a jealousy so violent it demanded a life. That shadow had a name, Barbara. As investigators dug deeper into the life of Leroy Fowler, the facade of a devoted, albeit tragic, domestic partnership completely crumbled. Leroy wasn't just a restless spirit, he was actively living a double life. He was seeing Barbara, a woman whose presence became the ultimate catalyst for destruction. The dynamic between the three of them wasn't a secret kept in the shadows. It was a volatile, openly hostile war zone. Text messages and voicemails revealed a bitter, venomous rivalry. Barbara would taunt Judy, throwing her age in her face, labeling her the old woman, while Judy fired back with equal vitriol, reducing Barbara to nothing more than a bitch, trying to steal what was rightfully hers. Imagine the psychological torment festering inside Judy Church. She had sacrificed her marriage, her savings, and her dignity for a man who was now parading his infidelity. But the final nail in the coffin wasn't just the affair itself, it was the escape plan. Whispers had begun to circulate that Leroy was packing up. He was talking about moving to Florida, seeking the warm sun and a fresh start. And there was a very real, terrifying possibility that Barbara was going to be the one sitting in the passenger seat. For Judy, this was the ultimate, unforgivable betrayal. Her investment was walking out the door, the fear of abandonment, compounded by the sheer humiliation of being tossed aside for a younger rival, twisted her love into a lethal, irredeemable hatred. She decided that if her money and devotion couldn't keep Leroy in Massachusetts, the antifreeze would. But here is where we must examine a profound, almost unfathomable contradiction in criminal psychology. Judy was a teacher. She was an educated woman who understood consequence, logic, and planning. She knew enough to aggressively scrub the crime scene with bleach, attempting to wash away the physical traces of her sinister cocktail. Yet, she committed an act of such staggering hubris and malice that it became her ultimate undoing. When the police finally executed a search warrant and breached the perimeter of that cluttered, chemical-soaked house, they didn't just find a nearly empty bottle of Rain-X brand dicing fluid, a product heavily concentrated with ethylene glycol. They also found a heavily stained, bright orange Powerade bottle stashed away, a silent, damning witness to the lethal mixture she had served her lover. but the physical evidence paled in comparison to the digital footprint she left behind. When investigators extracted the data from Judy's smartphone, they made a discovery that chills the blood. While Leroy was writhing on the floor, his kidneys calcifying, his lungs desperately gasping for oxygen, Judy did not reach for the phone to dial 911, not at first. Instead, she opened her camera app. She stood over the man she claimed to have given everything for, and she hit record. Not once, not twice. She filmed 13 separate videos of Leroy's agonizing descent into death. I want you to truly process that image. The heavy, ragged breathing echoing through the cluttered living room. The man who had been the center of her universe, dying in unimaginable pain. And there is Judy, standing silently behind the lens, capturing every tremor, every groan, immortalizing her revenge. It wasn't just a murder, it was a calculated execution. And those videos were her private trophies. It was a terrifying display of a woman who wanted to watch her betrayal be punished in real. She tried to clean the floors, but she couldn't bring herself to delete the digital evidence of her triumph. Her need to gloat outweighed her instinct to survive. Leroy Fowler eventually succumbed to the poison, but he did not leave this world without leaving a map to his killer. In the days leading up to his sudden, catastrophic collapse, Leroy had felt the shifting energy in his home. He knew the woman serving him dinner was harboring a dark, growing rage. He had pulled his son Douglas aside and looked him dead in the eye, delivering a chilling prophecy: if anything ever happens to me, look at Judy. He knew the monster sleeping beside him, but he underestimated how quickly she would strike. Fast forward to the cold, its stark reality of a courtroom in March 2026. The walls of the courthouse offered no warmth as the trial reached its devastating conclusion. Judy Church, now 67 years old, stood before the judge. The defiant woman who had once guarded her front door like a fortress was now stripped of her power. Across the room sat Leroy's family, bearing the heavy, exhausting weight of years of grief. They sat holding on to the memory of a father, a brother, a man who, despite his flaws, did not deserve this cruel end. As the guilty verdict was read, and a sentence of life in prison was handed down, I couldn't help but stare at the image of the former educator. I find myself asking, what is the exact breaking point? What is the precise moment a woman who spent her life standing at a chalkboard, guiding the futures of children, transforms into a cold-blooded killer? Perhaps it is the moment when love rots into ownership, when the fear of losing everything eclipses the value of human life. The judge's gavel echoed through the courtroom, a final, hollow thud that sealed Judy's fate. But long after the courtroom emptied, and long after the prison doors locked behind her, the unsettling truth remains. As the sound of the howling Salisbury wind fades into the dark, cinematic hum of our background score, all that lingers in the cold air is the raspy, trembling voice of a woman who built a home, only to poison it from the inside out. I've done everything for that man.